The wind moaned through the narrow alleys of Whitehall Palace, rattling the glass panes as if a ghost had lost its way through time. On a cold December evening in 1673, King Charles II sat hunched in a velvet chair, cradling a goblet not of wine, but of something far older. While England tore itself apart in civil war, and Cromwell's shadow loomed long and gray, Charles lived not as a king but as a fugitive. It was in these rootless years, amid the perfumed rot of Versailles and the fog-wreathed libraries of Prague, that he first heard the whispers. Whispers of an elixir passed from alchemists to kings, from grave robbers to priests. Leeching, mercury, trepanning, nothing availed him. Then one day Dr. Jonathan Goddard, royal physician and member of the Royal Society, approached with a peculiar vial, a preparation most revered. The key ingredient is tincture of skull, a tincture called Mumia, the liquefied essence of the dead, drawn from powdered skull and preserved flesh. Its thick, brackish color caught the light of the fire like coagulated ink. Galenic physicians had written of it. Apothecaries stocked it in glass vials labeled, not with warnings but promises. To consume the dead, one Flemish doctor told Charles beneath the flickering light of a single candle, is to rob death of its sting. No divine lightning, no sudden clarity, but the headaches ebbed. Slightly, or perhaps the king only believed they did. Either way, a new ritual was born. Not a day would pass without that strange, sacred dosa fusion of science and sorcery, medicine and murder. Alchemists were invited to dine at court, their blackened fingers staining the royal linens. Secret chambers beneath St. James's were built laboratories, cloaked in incense and humming with the low murmur of Latin. Some said Charles would sit for hours before a gilded skull, running his fingers along its hollow sockets like one might stroke the cheek of a lover long dead. The plague, the fire, and the whispers of rebellion still licking at the hem of his throne. Charles ruled with velvet gloves, but his eyes were those of a hunted man. Not a relic, he said. One recently departed. Someone of wit, of intellect. A poet, perhaps. Beneath the powdered wigs and the theater of court life, feared what all monarchs fear, that death does not bargain, and that even a king bleeds red. In silence, he raised the cup to his lips and drank. He believed in some baroque twist of divine cruelty, that to consume the dead was to house their echoes. That with each drop, he became more than a man. He became a cathedral of souls. And as the years unfolded, and the crown finally returned to his brow, so too did the shadow of that promise. Of skeletal hands reaching through his bed curtains, not to harm, but to claim. Of voices, familiar yet warped, whispering secrets that made his skin crawl. It tasted of iron, of earth, of something unspeakable. But he did not grimace. He had grown used to it, unwilling. For in that cup, they said, was the cure for all things mortal distilled from the skulls of the dead. To understand this moment, we must journey backward not to his coronation, or to the war but to the blackened years of his exile. When the young Charles wandered through foreign courts like a prince out of time, the king who had once laughed at the idea of drinking the dead now needed them. The next day his tongue was found nailed to the gate of London Bridge. Though the king denied involvement, his silence was telling. It was no mere superstition, or so they claimed. Charles, skeptical then, had laughed a sound that would grow rarer with age, but the seed had been planted. The Restoration brought with it a kingdom riddled with scars. So when the headaches began, those dull, grinding pangs behind the temples, his physicians came in droves. "It is Goddard's drops, your majesty," he said. "Shh." Charles stared at the amber liquid, silent. "It has restored princes to strength and led bishops from the edge of the grave." There was no ceremony to that first sip, but Charles was not content with simply feeling better. He became obsessed. His courtiers began to whisper. For the king's interest in the occult deepened. He began to ask questions no king should ask. What makes a soul linger? Can memory cling to bone? What happens if the skull belonged to someone? There were no answers, only silence, and the deepening shadows in his eyes. One courtier, a certain Lord Hargrave, dared to mock the king's practices during a drunken ball. But perhaps the most disturbing tale comes from an apothecary, his apprentice, who served at court in the winter of 1675. She claimed she saw the king demand a fresh skull. The apprentice was dismissed a week later. Her tongue mercifully remained intact. And so, the king drank. Not because he feared death, but because he feared its banality. The nothingness, the stillness. Charles craved memory, essence. But there was a price. Because the dreams began soon after. Dreams of laughter dry and rattling, echoing through halls with no doors. He would wake in sweat, grasping his throat, searching for a pulse he feared might not be his own. And still, he drank. Because by then, it was no longer medicine. It was memory. It was power. And like all power, it was addictive. By the time the court noticed the decline in the trembling hands, the sunken eyes, it was too late. Each morning, a fresh dose. Each evening, a longer silence. Always, always, that bitter taste of iron and dust. In the waning years of his reign, King Charles II no longer walked the halls of Whitehall with the ease of a monarch, but rather like a man haunted by echoes only he could hear. His gait, once proud and measured, had become tentative, hesitant as, though he feared the stone beneath his boots might give way to a crypt yawning below. The courtiers still bowed, still smiled, but their eyes flicked sideways. For beneath the gilded ceilings and perfumed masks, they all knew something was unraveling. Servants reported muffled chanting and a strange metallic odor that lingered in the air like rust on wet cloth. Once a maid claimed she saw him speaking softly to a small object wrapped in linen. When she leaned closer, she swore it was a fragment of a skull, cradled in his palm like a child. A darkness clung to the king like a second cloak. He had become ... different. Charles was not just their king. He was a believer, a convert to a theology no church dared preach. They spoke of vital essence, of spagyric preparations, of animating spirits trapped within organic matter. Behind closed doors they experimented on cadavers, boiling marrow into black syrups, distilling blood until it steamed like breath in the winter air. Their language remained academic, but their eyes were glazed. Their graves, if one could call them that, were hurried. Their remains ... unaccounted for. His laboratory became a temple, and Goddard's drops, merely holy water. At night, the candles in his private chamber burned longer than they should. The king's obsessions had narrowed. He had come with letters of introduction, claiming knowledge of a higher form of the elixir. A preparation not just from skull but from the pineal gland of the recently deceased, the seat of the soul, Descartes once called it, keyhole into the divine. He claimed to hear music in his blood, a melody stitched from the lives he had consumed. No longer content with powdered remnants, he began demanding names. Who had recently died? Were they learned? Did they write, think, love? He wanted those who had lived rich, complex lives. He believed no. Insisted that the blood and bone of such souls carried more weight. I do not fear the fire, only that no one will remember me. The richer the memory, the more potent the tincture. Physicians protested quietly, but what could they do? The Royal Society, ever eager to please the king, tried to rationalize his desires. One night, a German alchemist by the name of Friedrich Meisner arrived in London. But by consuming the lives of others, by binding their memory to his blood, he believed he could weave a tapestry that death could not tear. Charles, by now gaunt and yellow-eyed, welcomed him as a brother. What followed was a string of strange deaths, lowly poets, dissidents, a monk with a stammer, all found dead within days of Meisner's arrival. When whispers began that the king had created a stockpile of tinctures, labeled with the name and final words, of the donor few dared investigate. He would sit in silence for hours, holding those vials up to the light as if listening to them. "Today I shall drink Eliot," he once muttered to his valet. He dreamed of stars. "Let us see if I might catch a glimpse." No one questioned him. Even Meisner fled England in the night, leaving behind a page scribbled with the words, "He drinks not memory, but madness." And he feared, truly feared that he would find nothing left of himself. But they watched, and as they watched, the rot deepened. Perhaps a king is but a vessel, a cathedral of voices. If I must die, let it be with a chorus. The king's mind, once sharp and silver-tongued, began to slip. He spoke in riddles, laughed at invisible jests. One night, the queen found him collapsed before a mirror, whispering a single name over and over. Not hers, not a mistress. Thomas? No one knew who Thomas was, but when his secret chamber was later discovered, they found among the vials one labeled Thomas Wainwright, executed for heresy, 1659. The king had remembered. That perhaps was the point. For Charles no longer feared death. He feared forgetting. He feared that history would reduce him to ink and rumor. Living reliquary was no longer just Charles. He was the voice of Eliot, the sorrow of Thomas, the laughter of a dozen forgotten souls, echoing through a single frame. But his body, mortal, frail, burdened by more than it was meant to carry, began to betray him. Tremors in the hand, blackened gums, a heartbeat that stumbled like a drunkard in the dark. The Royal Society begged him to stop, but Charles would not listen. He couldn't. To stop would be to return to silence. To be alone in his own head, he whispered once, to the Bishop of Rochester, a confession half-prayer. Perhaps I was never meant to be one man, and so he drank, and the dreams came again. But now they were no longer dreams. They spoke back. In the final winter of his reign, King Charles II became a phantom within his own palace. Courtiers no longer sought audience with him unless summoned. The echo of his boots across the flagstones chilled even the most seasoned advisors. He had grown thin, spectral, his skin stretched too tight across cheekbones, eyes sunken like twin relics of some ancient curse. The physicians called it melancholic decay. But those who truly knew, those who had heard the cries in the night, whispered a different name. What was meant to be a dinner of state turned into of dread. The heather was thick with dew. She kissed me before they hanged her. Her name was Elsbeth. Between bites, the king began to speak in a voice that was not his own higher, trembling with a faint lisp. Possession. For Charles no longer spoke as a single man. During one chilling evening in January, the king called a private supper with 3 of his most trusted confidants, his brother James, the Earl of Rochester, and Dr. Goddard. "I recall the moors of Argyle," he said suddenly, unprompted. Servants reported screams echoing through the palace after midnight, screams not of one man but of many, different tones, different cadences. Some wept, some sang, some simply muttered, "Let me go." None at the table recognized the name. He ordered all remaining vials locked away. He summoned priests both Catholic and Anglican to perform prayers of cleansing. He forbade further experimentation, but it was too late. And in his weakened state, Charles could no longer distinguish between his thoughts and those that had taken root. That each drop had not merely been consumed, but invited. "He is not King of England," the friar whispered to a scribe before vanishing into the night. "He is King of Ghosts." He claimed to see visions, a monk in chains, a child watching a city burn, a soldier with a broken jaw reciting scripture from beneath the Thames. He issued decrees in names long buried. He walked through the garden, speaking softly to no one, sometimes stopping to weep, other times to laugh. Rumors were silenced, the truth buried. But those within the palace, the guards, the servants, the physicians knew. They heard. The memories of the dead, unfiltered and relentless, were clawing their way through the cracks in his mind, as though his lungs did not exhale breath, but confessions. Charles blinked, confused, as if awakening from a dream. His goblet trembled in his grip, and a dribble of the dark elixir traced a line down his chin. James, pale, demanded an explanation. But Charles only stared at his brother, smiled weakly, and whispered, "She's still with me?" The Bishop of Winchester visited him to deliver last rites. As he approached, Charles smiled and whispered, "He's trying to claw his way back." What began as memory had become infestation. The tinctures, once believed to carry echoes, now pulsed with voices. They did not fade with time. They grew louder. He began writing strange letters pages filled with names, fragments of poetry, foreign tongues he had never studied. He would begin a sentence as king and end it as a stuttering bookseller from Leeds. He claimed that he had lived 1,000 lives, and that each morning he awoke in a different one. His sleep was shallow, riddled with violent starts. In his more lucid moments, Charles tried to resist, because the voices no longer needed the tincture. They had nested. Confessor, a frightened friar from Ghent, claimed the king's body had become a mausoleum of memory, And indeed, Charles had begun to speak with the dead as though they stood beside him. He addressed empty chairs at council meetings. The court, terrified but loyal, blamed the illness on a mysterious fever. When Page claimed that if you stood near the king's bed as he slept, you could hear whispers rising from his very chest. One such night, his valet reported a chilling encounter. The king sat up suddenly, eyes wide, and whispered, "Who, your majesty?" the valet asked, paralyzed with fear. Charles turned slowly. "My father." And then, in a voice rich and regal, too rich it said, "Tell Parliament I forgive them." The valet fled. He never returned. Charles, by then, no longer knew which thoughts were his. But perhaps the most horrifying confession came just days before the end. "Do not pray for me. Pray for them. I took them in, but now they will not leave." And the bishop, trembling, looked into the king's eyes and saw not sorrow, but a crowd, a gathering. As though dozens of souls stood just behind the veil of his pupils, watching, waiting, whispering. The tincture had worked. He had become eternal, but not as a man, as a tomb. On the morning of February 6, 1685, the sky over London hung low and gray, thick with the smoke of winter hearths and something else, something heavier. Within the chambers of Whitehall, a silence had settled, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against the ribs like a held breath. King Charles II, monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was dying. The moment his breath began to stutter, the temperature dropped. Candles guttered. The glass panes of the windows fogged from the inside. Physicians whispered to one another, trying to mask their dread beneath the clatter of instruments. But they could not ignore the sound rising from the king's chest, as though his lungs were exhaling not air, but entire lives. Dr. Goddard, pale and drenched in sweat, pressed an ear to the king's sternum and recoiled in terror. Yet the room was not still. Those who attended his final hours would later say that the king did not die quietly, nor alone. It was not a rattle, it was murmuring, soft, layered cacophony of voices indistinct, overlapping, desperate. "There, speaking," he gasped. "He's not breathing, he's reciting." One chambermaid swore she heard her deceased brother's lullaby whispered from the king's throat in perfect tone. And indeed, Charles's lips were moving, rapidly, soundlessly, some recognized. Latin, others Greek. Some heard poems long thought lost. His brain was swollen, blackened. The marrow in his bones had crystallized. His blood was thick and metallic, clotted with strange particulate matter. The guns roared. Crown passed to James. History turned its page. His heart had shriveled not from disease, but from something else. Something unnamed. Physician's notes. Later destroyed by royal order. Recorded the words, "His body convulsed." Blood black and thick as ink welled from the corners of his eyes, his ears, his nose. But he did not cry out. Instead, he smiled. And then, in a voice both his and not his, he spoke aloud. "I am the choir. I am the crypt. I am the crown they cannot bury." Every remaining vial of Goddard's drops was seized, shattered, or hidden. The Royal Society denied all involvement. Alchemists were exiled, and Meisner, last heard from in a letter addressed to a monastery in Bavaria, warned. His final words, and then he fell still. But the room did not. Every person present would later describe a sudden and unnatural pressure in the air. Some fell to their knees. One physician screamed that his mother's voice had whispered in his ear. The Bishop of Winchester, shaking uncontrollably, fled the room, declaring his soul was not alone in leaving. The autopsy, conducted in hushed secrecy days later, revealed no ordinary death. The body contains not the remnants of a man, but the residue of many, its teeth filed flat as if worn down by grinding whispers. They buried him with full royal honors, of course. The people lined the streets grieving. The bells tolled. But some pages bleed. In the months that followed, strange occurrences plagued Whitehall. Still sold, that somewhere in the shadows of forgotten cathedrals or beneath the floors of ancient libraries, the echoes still murmur. A kingdom of voices recited by the mouth of one man who drank the dead to remember them in doing so, ensured they would never forget him. Footsteps echoing through sealed corridors. Books opening on their own 2 pages Charles once read aloud. Candles flickering violently in the presence of poetry. One made, driven mad by whispers, is found scratching verses into her own skin, verses that match those of Thomas Wainwright, the executed poet whose final words Charles had once consumed. The apothecary's archives were destroyed by royal decree. The vessel is gone, but the contents may remain. He has become contagion. And yet, the legend could not be buried. Over the years, strange relics emerged. A flask inscribed with a Latin phrase meaning to drink the memory. A velvet-bound book filled with royal handwriting that changed styles mid-sentence. A skull etched with names all claimed to be remnants of Charles's obsession. Some say the church hides these items. Others say they were scattered across Europe, taken by secret orders who believe memory is a form of divinity, that to consume a soul is to become holy. And there are those who claim the practice continues, that in certain dark circles, tinctures are still made. But most terrifying of all is the story passed among archivists and historians, the kind whispered after a third glass of wine. When the halls are empty and the candle burns low, that if you stand at the tomb of Charles II on a moonless night and place your ear to the stone, you can still hear him, not breathing, not resting, but speaking. Line after line, name after name, a king, not of land, but of echoes, forever murmuring in the dark.